Your kind needs to learn your place. Economy starts back there with the rest of the riffraff.
The words hit the air like a slap across the face at Chicago O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 3. Derek Morrison, 35, stood behind the SkyElite Airways first-class check-in counter with his arms crossed and contempt written across his weathered features. His navy blue uniform was pressed to perfection, his supervisor badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But his eyes held nothing but disdain as they fixed on the young black woman standing before him. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there in her gray hoodie and dark jeans, holding her phone with the digital boarding pass clearly visible on the screen. Her name was Alicia Brooks, though Derek Morrison had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his professional life. Before we dive deeper into the story of justice and accountability, I want you to know where this is heading. In the next 30 minutes, Derek Morrison wouldn't just lose his job. He would lose his career, his reputation, and his future in the aviation industry, because the woman he just insulted owned the airline he worked for. But let's rewind to see exactly how this moment of truth began. It was 7:45 a.m. on a humid Tuesday morning in July. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of business travelers rushing to catch flights, families herding children through security lines, and the constant drone of departure announcements echoing through the cavernous space. Alicia Brooks walked through the automatic doors of Terminal 3 looking like any other passenger. Her gray hoodie was soft cashmere that cost more than Derek's monthly salary, but he couldn't tell the difference. Her dark jeans were designer, but they looked perfectly ordinary. Her white sneakers were limited edition, but to Derek's untrained eye, they were just another pair of shoes. What Derek didn't know was that Alicia was conducting an undercover assessment of her own company. 3 days ago, her board of directors at Meridian Holdings had presented her with troubling reports about SkyElite Airways, the airline they had acquired just 2 months prior. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment were piling up. Social media was buzzing with stories of passengers being profiled, questioned, and humiliated. The previous management had dismissed these as isolated incidents, but Alicia didn't believe in isolated incidents when it came to human dignity. So she had devised a simple test. She would travel as an ordinary passenger, dressed down and unrecognizable, to see exactly how her employees treated customers who didn't fit their preconceived notions of who belonged in first class. The first-class check-in line was mercifully short. Only 3 people ahead of her, all dressed in expensive suits and carrying luxury luggage. Behind her, the economy line stretched back toward the terminal entrance like a river of tired humanity. Business executives checked their phones impatiently. Wealthy retirees adjusted their jewelry. And at the counter, Derek Morrison served each passenger with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but was professional enough to pass. When Alicia stepped forward, that smile vanished completely. Derek looked at her hoodie, then at her jeans, then back at her face with the kind of assessment that made assumptions based on appearance rather than reality. He didn't ask for her boarding pass. He didn't check her identification. He simply pointed toward the economy line with the casual cruelty of someone who had done this before. "Ma'am, the economy check-in is over there," he said, his voice carrying the false patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone he considered too stupid to understand. "This line is for first-class passengers only." Alicia remained perfectly still. Her voice was calm, steady, and carried the kind of quiet authority that came from years of boardroom negotiations and high-stakes decisions. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, holding up her phone. "Seat 1A. Derek glanced at the phone screen, but instead of scanning it, he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Look, honey, I don't know how you got that ticket, but there's obviously been some kind of mistake. Maybe you purchased an upgrade that didn't go through, or maybe someone played a prank on you, but you can't just stand in this line because you want to." Behind the counter, Carlos Rivera, 24, a junior check-in agent with kind eyes and an uncomfortable expression, shifted nervously. He had been working at SkyElite for 8 months, and he had seen Derek handle situations like this before. It never sat right with him, but Derek was his supervisor and Carlos needed this job to support his family. Carlos said quietly, "Maybe we should just scan her boarding pass and see what the computer says." Derek shot him a look that could have melted steel. "Carlos, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I can spot a problem passenger from across the terminal. This woman is trying to scam her way into first class, and I'm not going to enable it." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Other passengers in line were beginning to notice. A businessman in a tailored suit checked his watch impatiently. An elderly woman with pearls and perfectly styled silver hair craned her neck to see what was causing the delay. And in the economy line, people were pulling out their phones. Sarah Martinez, a travel blogger from San Francisco, was standing about 20 feet away waiting for her turn at the economy counter when she heard Derek's raised voice. Something in his tone made her look up from her laptop. When she saw what was happening, she discreetly opened her camera app and started recording. Alicia took a deep breath. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but she wasn't surprised. "Sir, I would appreciate it if you would scan my boarding pass and verify my reservation instead of making assumptions about my ability to purchase a ticket." Derek's face flushed red. "I don't have to scan anything. I can look at you and see that you don't belong in first class. Your kind always tries to pull stunts like this, thinking you can sweet-talk your way into seats you can't afford. It's not happening on my watch." The terminal seemed to pause. The businessman behind Alicia stepped back slightly. The elderly woman's eyes widened. Carlos Rivera's face went pale, and Sarah Martinez zoomed in with her camera capturing every word. That was when Alicia made a decision that would change everything. Instead of arguing, instead of demanding to speak to a manager, instead of making a scene, she simply pulled out a different phone. Not the phone with her boarding pass, but a secure device that connected directly to her legal team. She dialed a number from memory and waited. When the call connected, her voice remained perfectly calm. "This is Alicia Brooks. I'm at Chicago O'Hare Terminal 3 SkyElite check-in counter. Please initiate Protocol 7 for discriminatory treatment assessment. Full documentation and legal review authorized." Derek Morrison had no idea what Protocol 7 was, but something in Alicia's voice made him pause. The way she spoke wasn't the voice of someone trying to scam an upgrade. It was the voice of someone with authority. Real authority. "What's Protocol 7? Carlos whispered. Derek ignored him, focusing on Alicia with growing unease. "Who are you calling, some kind of complaint hotline? I'm not intimidated by threats, lady." Alicia ended the call and looked at Derek with the kind of steady gaze that had closed billion-dollar deals and launched international expansion plans. "I wasn't making threats, Mr. Morrison. I was documenting evidence of why you're about to lose your job." The words were spoken so quietly that Derek had to lean forward to hear them. But they hit him like a physical blow. There was something in her tone, something in the way she said his name, even though he hadn't introduced himself, something in the confidence with which she spoke that made his stomach clench with the first flutter of real fear. "Are you recording this?" he demanded, looking around at the growing crowd of passengers who had stopped to watch the confrontation. "I don't need to," Alicia replied. "Security cameras are recording everything. Your computer system is logging this interaction, and I suspect several passengers are already sharing this moment on social media." She was right. Sarah Martinez had switched to live streaming on Instagram. Her caption read, "Watching discrimination happen in real time at O'Hare. This is unacceptable." Already dozens of viewers were commenting and sharing the stream. Derek's supervisor confidence was beginning to crack. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm going to call security if you don't move to the correct line right now." "Please do," Alicia said. "I think security would be very interested in reviewing this situation." Carlos Rivera couldn't take it anymore. "Derek, just scan her boarding pass." "What's the worst that could happen?" Derek glared at him, but the mounting pressure from the growing crowd of onlookers and the strange confidence of this woman in the hoodie was beginning to wear him down. With exaggerated reluctance, he grabbed the handheld scanner from his belt and pointed it at Alicia's phone screen. The device beeped once, green light flashed, and Derek's face went white as he read the screen. Passenger Brooks Alicia. Seat 1A. Status Priority VIP. Special handling required. He blinked at the screen, then at Alicia, then back at the screen. This must be a mistake. The computer is glitching. Is it, Alicia asked, or did you just assume that a young black woman in casual clothes couldn't afford a first-class ticket? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the crowd had grown larger. Passengers were openly recording now. Sarah Martinez's live stream had gained over 200 viewers in just a few minutes, and Derek Morrison realized that he had just made the kind of mistake that could end careers. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing, instead of recognizing that he might be wrong, Derek doubled down on his prejudice. "I don't care what that machine says," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I know fraud when I see it. You probably hacked the system or used someone else's credit card. I'm calling security and having you arrested for attempting to board with falsified documents." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient noise of the terminal seemed to fade as hundreds of passengers turned to stare at the unfolding drama. Sarah Martinez's live stream viewer count jumped to over 500. Comments were pouring in faster than she could read them, and Alicia Brooks stood perfectly still, watching Derek Morrison destroy his own life with every word. "Are you absolutely certain you want to make that call?" she asked quietly. "Lady, I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Derek reached for the phone at his station, dialing the 3-digit code for airport security. While he waited for the connection, Alicia made another call on her secure device. "Margaret," she said when the call connected. "It's happening exactly as we expected. The discrimination is not just cultural, it's deliberate and aggressive. I need you to prepare immediate termination paperwork for Chicago ground staff. Also, contact our legal team. We're going to need documentation of everything that happens in the next 10 minutes. Derek overheard part of the conversation, but the words didn't quite register. He was too focused on his call to security, too committed to his version of reality, where he was the hero protecting the integrity of first-class service from fraudulent passengers. "Security. This is Derek Morrison at SkyElite Check-in Terminal 3. I need officers to respond for a passenger attempting to board with falsified credentials. Possible identity theft and credit card fraud. Female, black, approximately 25, 30, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans." He hung up with a satisfied expression. "Security will be here in 3 minutes. I hope whatever scam you're running was worth it because you're about to be arrested." Alicia looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Morrison, in your 12 years of working for this airline, how many black passengers have you accused of fraud?" The question caught him off guard. What does that have to do with anything? "Answer the question." "How many?" Derek's face flushed again. "I don't keep track of race. I just know fraud when I see it. And how often do you demand verification from white passengers with first-class tickets?" "That's different." How Derek opened his mouth, then closed it. Around him, the crowd was listening to every word. Sarah Martinez had turned her phone to capture his face as he struggled to answer. Carlos Rivera was staring at his supervisor with growing horror, finally understanding what kind of person he had been working for. "It's different because—" Derek started, then stopped. Because there was no good way to finish that sentence. There was no explanation that wouldn't reveal the prejudice that had driven every decision he'd made that morning. Airport security arrived just as Derek ran out of words. 2 officers, both experienced professionals who had dealt with thousands of passenger disputes, approached the check-in counter with the weary patience of people who had seen everything. "What seems to be the problem here?" asked Officer Janet Thompson, a 10-year veteran of airport security, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Derek straightened up, his confidence returning now that backup had arrived. "This woman is attempting to board with fraudulent first-class credentials. I've verified that the ticket doesn't belong to her, and I suspect identity theft and credit card fraud." Officer Thompson looked at Alicia, taking in her calm demeanor and the way she stood without any of the nervous energy that usually accompanied people who were actually committing fraud. "Ma'am, can I see your identification and boarding pass?" Alicia handed over her driver's license and held up her phone with the digital boarding pass. Officer Thompson examined both carefully, then looked at Derek's computer screen where the verified reservation was still displayed. "Sir," she said to Derek, "according to your own system, this passenger is verified for seat 1A with special VIP handling." What exactly is fraudulent about this? Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But look at her. She doesn't look like what, sir? And there it was, the moment when Derek Morrison had to either admit his prejudice or find some other excuse for his behavior. He chose poorly. "She doesn't look like she can afford a first-class ticket," he said. "People like her don't fly first class unless something shady is going on." The words echoed through the terminal like a gunshot. Officer Thompson's expression hardened. Carlos Rivera buried his face in his hands. Sarah Martinez's live stream exploded with comments of outrage and disbelief. And Alicia Brooks looked at Derek Morrison with the calm certainty of someone who had just gotten exactly the evidence she needed. Officer Thompson Alicia said quietly, "I'd like to file a formal complaint for discrimination based on race and socioeconomic profiling." "Ma'am, you absolutely have that right." "Sir," she said to Derek, "I'm going to need you to step away from your station while we sort this out." But Derek wasn't done. Even faced with the evidence of his own prejudice, even confronted by security, and recorded by dozens of passengers, he couldn't let it go. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "I was doing my job. I was protecting the integrity of our first-class service. People like her have been scamming airlines for years, and I'm not going to let it happen on my watch." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Officer Thompson exchanged a look with her partner. Carlos Rivera slowly backed away from Derek as if he were radioactive. And Sarah Martinez's livestream viewer count hit 1000 as people shared the video across social media platforms. Alicia's phone rang. She answered it calmly. "Yes, Margaret. Yes, I heard every word. Yes, proceed with immediate termination. And Margaret, make sure legal knows that he just doubled down on his discrimination in front of witnesses and security cameras." She ended the call and looked at Derek with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Mr. Morrison, you've just provided us with a perfect case study in why some people shouldn't work in customer service." Derek's bravado was finally beginning to crack. Something about the way she spoke, something about the phone call she'd just made, something about the confidence with which she handled the situation was starting to penetrate his prejudice-clouded judgment. Who are you?" he asked. Alicia smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a cruel smile or a triumphant smile. It was the smile of someone who was about to teach a very important lesson. Someone who believes that every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they're dressed or what they look like. Someone who thinks that judging people by their appearance rather than their character is not just wrong, it's expensive. She paused, letting the words sink in. And someone who has the authority to make sure that people who can't understand that simple concept find other lines of work. The SkyElite first-class lounge was a sanctuary of marble floors, leather seating, and soft jazz that promised refuge from the chaos of the main terminal. After the confrontation at check-in, Alicia needed a few minutes to process what had just happened and prepare for the flight ahead. She also needed to make some calls. Elena Vasquez, the lounge manager, greeted her with genuine professionalism. At 29, Elena had worked her way up from a customer service agent to management through hard work and a genuine commitment to hospitality. She scanned Alicia's boarding pass without a second glance and smiled warmly. "Welcome to the SkyElite Lounge, Miss Brooks. We have fresh sushi at the dining station, a selection of premium wines, and private shower facilities if you'd like to refresh before your flight. Is there anything specific I can help you with today, finally?" Alicia thought. Someone doing their job the right way. "Just a quiet corner and some sparkling water, please. Thank you for the warm welcome." Elena led her to a secluded seating area near the windows overlooking the tarmac. Alicia settled into a leather chair and pulled out her secure tablet. She had work to do. The tablet wasn't a standard iPad. It was a heavily modified device used by Meridian Holdings executives for sensitive corporate communications. Encrypted, secure, and connected to servers that could access any system within their corporate network, including SkyElite Airways' complete personnel files, customer service records, and incident reports. Alicia opened a new report and began typing Subject Ground Staff Assessment, Chicago O'Hare Terminal 3, Employee Derek Morrison Check-in Supervisor Incident, Racial Profiling, Customer Harassment, False Accusations. Recommendation: Immediate termination. Additional notes: Employee doubled down on discriminatory behavior when confronted by security, showing complete lack of awareness or remorse. She saved the file and opened another. Derek Morrison's employment record appeared on screen. 12 years with various airlines, most recently 18 months with SkyElite. Customer complaints in his file dating back 3 years. Complaints that followed a pattern she recognized all too well. A black family from Atlanta delayed for additional verification. A Hispanic businessman questioned about his ability to afford his ticket. An elderly Asian woman subjected to extra security screening that other passengers were not required to undergo. All complaints filed. All complaints marked as unsubstantiated and resolved through counseling. Counseling that clearly hadn't worked. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Collins. Her chief legal officer, Derek Morrison, has been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. Carlos Rivera has been moved to different shift to avoid retaliation. Legal team standing by for full documentation review. Good. But Derek was just the beginning. If the ground staff were this comfortable with their prejudice, she could only imagine what was waiting for her on the actual flight. Elena Vasquez approached with a crystal glass of sparkling water and a small plate of artisanal nuts. "Is there anything else you need, Miss Brooks? You seem to be working hard." Alicia looked up from her tablet. Elena's concern seemed genuine, her service professional but not obsequious, a stark contrast to the treatment she'd received at check-in. "Elena, can I ask you something in your experience working for SkyElite? How consistent is the service quality across different departments?" Elena paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Every department has its challenges, ma'am. Some staff members are more committed to our service standards than others. Have you ever witnessed or heard about passengers being treated poorly because of their race or appearance?" The question was direct, and Elena's reaction told Alicia everything she needed to know. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way she glanced around to make sure no one was listening, the careful consideration before she answered. "I believe that every passenger deserves respect," Elena said finally. "But I think some of my colleagues might need reminding of that from time to time." It was a diplomatic answer, but it was also an honest one. Alicia appreciated Elena's professionalism in not throwing her coworkers under the bus, but she also noted the careful phrasing that acknowledged problems without directly accusing anyone. "Thank you for your honesty, Elena. You're doing excellent work here." "Thank you, ma'am. If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." As Elena walked away, Alicia's phone rang. The caller ID showed Thomas Patterson, CFO. "Thomas, good morning. Alicia Margaret briefed me on the check-in incident. Are you all right? I'm fine. More importantly, we're getting exactly the evidence we suspected we would find. Derek Morrison just provided us with a textbook case of racial profiling, complete with security camera footage and witness testimony. Do you want to abort the rest of the assessment? We have enough to begin reforming ground operations." Alicia considered the suggestion. She could end the test, now reveal her identity, and start implementing changes immediately. But she knew that what had happened at check-in was probably just the tip of the iceberg. If she wanted to truly understand the scope of the problem, she needed to complete the full passenger experience. "No, I'm continuing with the flight. If the ground staff are this comfortable with discrimination, I need to see what's happening in the air. But I want legal standing by, and I want full recording capability activated on my devices." Already done. Margaret has authorized Protocol 7 recording. Every interaction is being logged and documented. If anything else happens, you'll have ironclad evidence. Good. And Thomas, start preparing comprehensive termination packages. I have a feeling we're going to need them. After ending the call, Alicia spent another 20 minutes in the lounge observing the way different passengers were treated. Elena and her staff maintained the same level of professionalism with everyone, regardless of age, race, or how they were dressed. It gave her hope that not all of SkyElite service culture was poisoned, but she also noticed things that bothered her. The way some passengers looked at her when she sat in the first-class lounge. The subtle double-takes, the quiet comments to traveling companions, the assumption that she must be in the wrong place. Most people were polite enough to keep their thoughts to themselves, but the undercurrent of judgment was unmistakable. At 8:30 a.m., the boarding announcement for Flight 447 to Miami echoed through the lounge. Alicia gathered her belongings, thanked Elena for her excellent service, and walked toward the gate. She had a feeling the real test was about to begin. The jet bridge leading to SkyElite Flight 447 smelled of aviation fuel and recycled air. Alicia walked down the inclined corridor with steady steps, her mind focused on what lay ahead. Behind her, she could hear the conversations of other first-class passengers, business executives discussing deals, wealthy retirees planning European vacations, and the general murmur of people accustomed to premium service. At the aircraft door, 2 flight attendants stood like sentinels greeting passengers. The younger one was Jessica Williams, 22, Hispanic with nervous energy and kind eyes. She was new to SkyElite, having joined the crew just 4 months earlier after graduating from flight attendant training. The other was Victoria Ashford, 34, head purser, and the kind of woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a luxury magazine. Victoria's appearance was flawless in the way that suggested hours of careful preparation. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon that revealed perfectly sculpted cheekbones. Her makeup was subtle, but expertly applied, highlighting sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog and judge everything they saw. Her uniform was tailored to fit her slender frame like a second skin, and she wore it with the confidence of someone who knew she looked stunning. But there was something cold in her beauty, something calculated in the way she smiled. It was the smile of someone who had learned that appearance could be a weapon, that looking perfect gave you power over people who didn't meet your standards. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Blackwood," Victoria purred as Richard Blackwood, a distinguished-looking businessman in an expensive charcoal suit, approached the aircraft door. She practically glowed with deference as she took his jacket and ushered him toward his seat. "Seat 2A, as always. I've made sure we have your preferred champagne chilled and waiting." "Excellent as always," Victoria Richard replied with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to special treatment. "I trust this flight will be as smooth as usual." "Of course, sir. We live to serve our valued passengers." James Peterson, a tech executive in his early 30s, was next in line. He received a professional greeting and directions to his seat without fanfare. Nothing wrong with the service, but notably less warm than what Richard had received. Then Alicia stepped up to the door. Victoria's smile didn't just fade, it was deleted. Her blue eyes swept over Alicia's casual attire with the kind of assessment that made assumptions and reached conclusions before any words were spoken. The silence stretched for several seconds, while Victoria processed what she was seeing. A young black woman in a hoodie and jeans, holding a first-class boarding pass. "Excuse me," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the false patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone she considered intellectually deficient. "First class is at the front of the aircraft. You'll want to continue to the back for economy seating." Jessica Williams, standing beside Victoria, shifted uncomfortably. She had seen Alicia's boarding pass when she handed it over, had noticed the seat assignment clearly displayed as 1A, but she was too new and too intimidated by Victoria's commanding presence to speak up. "I'm in first class," Alicia said calmly, holding up her phone with the boarding pass visible. "Seat 1A. Victoria glanced at the screen dismissively. "I'm sorry, but there's obviously been some kind of error. First class has a certain standard that we maintain. I'm sure you understand." The words were carefully chosen to avoid direct accusations, but the meaning was unmistakable. Victoria was telling her she didn't belong in first class because of how she looked. James Peterson, already seated in 3C, was watching the interaction with growing discomfort. Something about Victoria's tone bothered him. He discreetly pulled out his phone and opened his social media app, thinking he might document whatever was about to happen. "What kind of standard?" Alicia asked, her voice remaining perfectly level. Victoria's smile became even more artificial. "Well, we expect our first-class passengers to dress appropriately for the premium cabin experience. It's about maintaining the right atmosphere for all our valued guests. And you've determined that my clothing doesn't meet that standard. I'm just trying to prevent any awkwardness for you or the other passengers. Perhaps we can arrange an upgrade for a future flight when you're more appropriately dressed." The condescension in Victoria's voice was like acid. She wasn't just refusing service, she was doing it in a way designed to humiliate and diminish. This wasn't policy. It was personal prejudice dressed up in corporate language. Richard Blackwood, already seated and sipping his champagne, called out from his seat. "Is there some kind of problem? We're supposed to be departing soon?" Victoria turned toward him with an apologetic smile. "Just a small seating confusion, Mr. Blackwood. Nothing that can't be resolved quickly." She turned back to Alicia with renewed confidence, emboldened by Richard's impatience. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to your correct seat now. We need to begin our departure preparations." Alicia remained perfectly still. "I would like you to scan my boarding pass and verify my seat assignment through your system. That won't be necessary. I can see clearly that there's been a mistake. Scan it." The two words carried such quiet authority that Victoria actually took a step back. But instead of complying, instead of doing the simple professional thing that would have resolved the situation immediately, she chose to escalate. "I don't take orders from passengers," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly. "And I certainly don't take orders from passengers who are trying to scam their way into seats they can't afford." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Jessica Williams gasped audibly. James Peterson's finger hovered over the record button on his phone. And somewhere in the back of the plane, other passengers began to notice that something unusual was happening in first class. Alicia looked at Victoria with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout the encounter. "Miss Ashford, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to handle this professionally. Please scan my boarding pass and verify my seat assignment." Victoria blinked, startled. "How did you know my name?" "Your name tag. Now, please scan my boarding pass. I've already told you that won't be necessary. Security will be here shortly to escort you to your proper seat." That was when Alicia made a decision that would change the trajectory of Victoria Ashford's life forever. Instead of arguing further, instead of demanding to speak to the captain, instead of making threats or raising her voice, she simply pulled out her phone and made a call. "Margaret," she said when the call connected, "we have a second incident. Flight crew this time." "Yes, it's exactly what we expected. Prepare termination paperwork for Victoria Ashford, head purser. Flight 447. Also, prepare documentation for a formal discrimination complaint with the FAA." Victoria's face went white. Something about the way Alicia spoke, something about the professional nature of the call, something about the confidence in her voice suggested that this wasn't a passenger making empty threats. "Who were you calling?" Victoria demanded. Alicia ended the call and looked at her with the same steady gaze that had unnerved Derek Morrison at check-in. "Someone who has the authority to ensure that discrimination doesn't happen on SkyElite flights. You're lying. You're just trying to intimidate me because I caught you trying to steal a first-class seat." James Peterson couldn't take it anymore. He pressed record and started live streaming on Instagram. "This is unbelievable," he muttered into his phone. "Flight attendant is refusing to let a passenger board because of how she's dressed." The live stream immediately began gaining viewers. Comments started pouring in as people shared the video, and somewhere in the back of the plane, other passengers were pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. Victoria noticed the phones and felt a flutter of panic. But instead of backing down, instead of reconsidering her position, instead of simply scanning the boarding pass like any reasonable person would do, She doubled down on her prejudice. "Turn those cameras off immediately," she demanded. "This is a security issue and I won't have it recorded." "Actually," Alicia said quietly, "I think transparency is exactly what we need right now." Her phone rang. She answered it calmly. "Yes, Thomas. Yes, I can hear everything. Yes, she just called it a security issue and demanded that witnesses stop recording. Please make sure legal has all of this documented." She ended the call and looked at Victoria with something that might have been pity. "Miss Ashford, you're about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between authority and prejudice." But Victoria Ashford wasn't done. She was beautiful, she was powerful in her domain, and she had never been challenged by someone she considered beneath her station. The idea that this woman in casual clothes could threaten her position was absurd. So she made the decision that would end her career. "Security to first class immediately," she announced over the aircraft intercom. "We have a passenger attempting to board with fraudulent credentials. Possible identity theft and credit card fraud." The announcement echoed through the cabin, ensuring that every passenger on the flight would witness what came next. James Peterson's live stream viewer count jumped to over 500. Comments were exploding across the screen, and Alicia Brooks stood perfectly calm watching Victoria Ashford destroy her own future one word at a time. The aircraft cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence after Victoria's announcement. Every passenger within earshot turned to stare at the unfolding drama in first class. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder somehow, and even the usual bustle of passengers settling into their seats paused as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. Victoria Ashford stood in the doorway of the aircraft like a beautiful sentinel, her perfectly applied makeup and elegant uniform creating a stark contrast with the ugliness of her words. She looked at Alicia with the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from believing you've just won a battle. In her mind, she had successfully protected the sanctity of first class from someone who clearly didn't belong there. "People like you don't fly first class," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "You may have found some way to game the system, but I've been doing this job for 8 years and I know fraud when I see it. Security will escort you to your real seat in the back, where people like you belong." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. James Peterson, still live-streaming from seat 3C, zoomed in on Victoria's face as she spoke. His viewer count had climbed to over 800, and comments were scrolling by too fast to read. Sarah Martinez, the travel blogger who had witnessed the check-in incident, had somehow managed to get on the same flight and was recording from seat 5A. Her earlier video from the terminal had already gone viral, and this new footage was adding fuel to the fire. Alicia remained perfectly still, her voice calm and measured. "Miss Ashford, I would like you to scan my boarding pass and verify my reservation through your computer system." Victoria let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I don't need to scan anything. I can look at you and know that you don't belong in seat 1A. Check your passenger manifest, Victoria. Alicia Brooks, seat 1A, special VIP handling. I've already told you that there's been some kind of mistake or fraud. Probably used someone else's credit card. This is identity theft, and I'm not going to be complicit in it." Jessica Williams, the young Hispanic flight attendant standing beside Victoria, was visibly trembling. In her 4 months with SkyElite, she had never seen anything like this. She wanted to speak up, wanted to suggest that maybe they should just scan the boarding pass like the passenger requested, but Victoria's commanding presence was intimidating, and Jessica was afraid of losing her job if she contradicted her supervisor. "Miss Ashford," Jessica said quietly. "Maybe we should just Jessica go check on the passengers in economy," Victoria snapped without taking her eyes off Alicia. "I can handle this situation." Richard Blackwood, growing impatient in seat 2A, set down his champagne glass with an audible clink. "For heaven's sake, what's taking so long? Some of us have connections to make." Victoria turned to him with an apologetic smile that was completely different from the cold mask she'd shown Alicia. "I'm so sorry for the delay, Mr. Blackwood. We're just dealing with a passenger who seems to be confused about her seat assignment." Richard looked past Victoria at Alicia, taking in her casual attire with obvious disapproval. "Well, it's obvious she doesn't belong in first class. Why don't you just move her to where she's supposed to be so we can get on with the flight?" The casual cruelty of his dismissal was stunning. He wasn't even talking to Alicia directly. He was talking about her as if she weren't there, as if she were an object to be moved rather than a human being deserving basic respect. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do," Sir Victoria replied. "Unfortunately, some passengers think they can argue their way into seats they haven't paid for." Around the cabin, other passengers were beginning to react. Some pulled out phones to record the confrontation. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. A few seemed to agree with Victoria and Richard, nodding their approval at what they saw as proper enforcement of first-class standards. But in Seat 7, Marcus Williams, a civil rights attorney traveling to Miami for a conference, was watching with growing outrage. He had seen this kind of discrimination before, had fought against it in courtrooms across the country, and he recognized exactly what was happening. "Excuse me," he called out, standing up in his seat. "I'm an attorney, and what I'm witnessing here appears to be textbook discrimination. This passenger has a valid boarding pass for Seat 1A. There's no legal justification for refusing her service based on her appearance." Victoria spun around to face him, her beautiful features twisted with annoyance. "Sir, please sit down. This is a security matter, and I don't need legal advice from passengers." "Actually, you do," Marcus replied calmly, "because what you're doing is illegal under federal civil rights laws. And since everyone is recording this, you're creating evidence that could be used against both you personally and this airline in a discrimination lawsuit." James Peterson's live stream exploded with comments. Viewers were sharing the video across social media platforms. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination was starting to trend. And Victoria Ashford was completely oblivious to the fact that her career was being destroyed in real time. "I don't care who you think you are," Victoria said to Marcus. "I'm the head purser on this aircraft, and I have the authority to determine passenger seating based on security and safety concerns." "What security concern?" Alicia asked quietly. "I'm standing calmly, speaking respectfully, and asking only that you verify my seat assignment through your computer system." "What exactly is the security threat?" Victoria turned back to her, and for a moment her mask slipped. The real Victoria showed through, not the professional flight attendant, not the customer service representative, but the woman who believed that certain people belonged in certain places and that it was her job to enforce those boundaries. "The security threat is fraud," she said. "The threat is people like you thinking you can scam your way into first class by pretending to be someone you're not. The threat is passengers who lie about their ability to afford premium seating and then expect us to just go along with it. People like me. You know exactly what I mean." And there it was, the raw prejudice that had been lurking beneath the surface of every interaction. Victoria Ashford had just revealed that her objections had nothing to do with security, nothing to do with procedures, and everything to do with her assumption that a young black woman in casual clothes couldn't legitimately belong in first class. Alicia's phone rang. She answered it calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. "Yes, Margaret." "Yes, I heard every word." "Yes, she just made it explicitly clear that this is about race, not security. Please proceed with immediate termination paperwork and contact the FAA about discrimination complaints." She ended the call and looked at Victoria with the same steady gaze that had unnerved everyone she'd encountered that morning. "Miss Ashford, you've just provided us with a perfect example of why some people shouldn't work in customer service." Victoria's confidence was beginning to crack. Something about the professional nature of Alicia's phone call, something about the way she spoke with calm authority, something about the growing crowd of witnesses was starting to penetrate her prejudice-clouded judgment. Who do you keep calling people who have the authority to ensure that passengers are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or appearance? You're lying. You're just trying to intimidate me because I caught you trying to steal a seat. That was when Richard Blackwood made his contribution to the disaster. Standing up in his seat and turning to face the cabin full of recording passengers, he declared in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is exactly what's wrong with air travel today. People who can't afford first class trying to sneak in through some kind of scam and then crying discrimination when they get caught. I fly this route every month, and I know what a real first-class passenger looks like. He gestured toward Alicia with obvious disdain. Look at her. Does she look like she can afford a $2,000 ticket? That jewelry is probably fake, those clothes are clearly cheap, and she's probably hoping to get an upgrade by making a scene. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Victoria looked uncomfortable with Richard's naked prejudice. Marcus Williams was standing again, his lawyer's mind already cataloging the evidence for future legal proceedings. And Alicia Brooks stood perfectly calm in the center of the storm, watching her employees and passenger destroy their own lives with every word. James Peterson's live stream had gained over 1,500 viewers. Comments were pouring in from people expressing outrage, disbelief, and support for the passenger being discriminated against. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination was trending nationally. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, and none of the people involved in creating this disaster had any idea that they were about to become infamous. Mr. Blackwood, Alicia said quietly, "You've just made some very interesting assumptions about my financial status based on my appearance." "Would you care to explain the logic behind those assumptions?" Richard puffed up with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged about his prejudices. Logic. It's obvious. People who can afford first class dress appropriately and conduct themselves with proper decorum. They don't try to sneak into premium cabins wearing hoodies and sneakers. And you've determined that my clothing indicates I can't afford this ticket, lady. That hoodie probably cost $20 at Target. Those jeans look like something a college student would wear. And those sneakers are definitely not the kind of footwear you'd expect from someone with money. What Richard didn't know was that Alicia's hoodie was hand-woven cashmere from a boutique Italian designer that cost more than his monthly salary. Her jeans were from a luxury denim company that celebrities wore on red carpets. And her sneakers were limited edition collector's items that sold for more than most people spent on their cars. But, more importantly, what Richard didn't know was that it didn't matter. Even if her clothes had come from discount stores, even if she had dressed in the cheapest possible attire, she still deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The price of someone's clothing had nothing to do with their worth as a human being, or their right to customer service. "So you believe that a person's clothing determines their value?" Alicia asked. "I believe that people should dress appropriately for the situation they're in. First class is a premium experience, and it should be reserved for people who understand and appreciate that experience. And you've determined that I don't understand or appreciate premium service based on my appearance." Richard was digging himself deeper with every word, but he was too blinded by his own arrogance to realize it. "Look, I'm not trying to be mean, but facts are facts. You don't look like you belong here, you don't act like you belong here, and frankly, you probably don't belong here." Victoria nodded her agreement, emboldened by Richard's support. Exactly. This is about maintaining standards and protecting the experience for passengers who actually paid for first-class service. Marcus Williams couldn't contain himself any longer. "What you're both describing is textbook discrimination. You're making assumptions about this passenger's ability to afford her ticket based solely on her race and clothing. That's illegal, it's morally wrong, and it's being recorded by dozens of witnesses." "Oh, please," Richard scoffed. "Everything is discrimination these days. Sometimes a scam is just a scam, and sometimes people need to be called out for trying to get something they haven't earned. And how exactly have you determined that she hasn't earned her seat by looking at her?" And there it was again. The admission that their objections were based entirely on appearance, not on any actual evidence of wrongdoing. Richard Blackwood and Victoria Ashford had just confessed to discrimination in front of a cabin full of witnesses and live-streaming cameras. Alicia's phone rang again. She answered it with the same calm professionalism she'd displayed throughout the entire confrontation. "Yes, Thomas. Yes, I heard every word. Yes, they've made it completely clear that this is about race and socioeconomic profiling. Please add Mr. Blackwood to the permanent no-fly list and ensure that legal has documentation of all his statements." She ended the call and looked at Richard with the same steady gaze that had unnerved everyone else. Mr. Blackwood, you've just provided us with an excellent example of how prejudice can destroy someone's life in real time. Richard's face was beginning to turn red. Are you threatening me because I don't respond well to threats from people trying to scam their way into first class? I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply documenting evidence of discrimination for future legal proceedings. Legal proceedings, you're going to sue because a flight attendant caught you trying to steal a seat. I'm going to ensure that passengers are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or race. Victoria was getting nervous. The phones, the calls, the calm confidence with which this passenger was handling the situation, none of it matched her assumptions about someone trying to scam their way into first class. Real fraudsters usually became defensive when challenged. They made excuses, got angry, or tried to leave quickly. They didn't calmly make professional phone calls and speak about legal proceedings with the confidence of someone who actually had legal resources. Look, Victoria said, her voice beginning to waver. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't you just show me some identification and we can sort this out quietly? But it was too late for quiet resolution. Richard Blackwood wasn't done talking, and every word that came out of his mouth was digging the hole deeper for all of them. Identification, he laughed. She probably has fake ID to go with the fake boarding pass. I've seen this scam before. These people get someone's credit card information, book a ticket, print a boarding pass, and hope to bluff their way into a seat they can't afford. These people— Marcus Williams stood up again, his voice sharp with indignation. What exactly do you mean by these people, Mr. Blackwood? Richard realized he had stepped over a line, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. You know what I mean. People who try to game the system. People who think rules don't apply to them. People who cry discrimination every time someone calls them out on their behavior. People who are black— You mean I didn't say anything about race? You're the one making this about race. Then, what did you mean by these people? Richard's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound overtly racist. But there was no good answer because his entire argument was based on racial prejudice thinly disguised as concern about airline security. Around the cabin, passengers were recording every word. The live streams were being shared across social media platforms. News outlets were beginning to reach out to passengers for comments. And somewhere in corporate offices across the country, executives were watching their reputations being destroyed in real time. Alicia waited patiently for Richard to find his words, knowing that anything he said would only make things worse for him. She had dealt with men like Richard Blackwood before, men who believed their wealth and status gave them the right to treat other people as inferior men who used coded language to express prejudice they were too cowardly to state directly. I meant, Richard said finally, people who don't belong in first class trying to get into first class through dishonest means. And you've determined that she doesn't belong in first class, and by using my eyes and my common sense. To assess what exactly? To assess whether someone looks like they can afford a $2,000 ticket. And there was the confession that would end his social and professional life. Richard Blackwood had just admitted in front of dozens of witnesses and live streaming cameras that he judged people's financial status and worthiness based on their appearance. He had revealed himself as the kind of person who believed that certain people belonged in certain places, and that he had the right to enforce those boundaries. Victoria realized that Richard was making things worse for both of them, but she couldn't seem to stop the disaster from unfolding. Every instinct told her to simply scan the boarding pass and resolve the situation, but her pride and prejudice wouldn't let her admit that she might have been wrong. Security should be here any minute, she said, trying to regain control of the situation. They can sort this out and escort her to her proper seat. And if security determines that my seat assignment is correct, Alicia asked, then we'll figure it out. Will you apologize for your assumptions? Victoria's silence was answer enough. Even faced with the possibility that she might be wrong, even confronted with the evidence of her own prejudice, she couldn't bring herself to consider that she might owe this passenger an apology. That silence stretched through the cabin like a spreading stain. Everyone could see it now, the ugly truth beneath the professional uniforms and polite language. This wasn't about security or procedures or maintaining standards. This was about people in positions of power using that power to diminish and humiliate someone they considered beneath them. James Peterson's live stream had reached 2,000 viewers. The comments were a mix of outraged support for the passenger and calls for boycotts of SkyElite Airways. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination was spreading across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And traditional media outlets were beginning to pick up the story. But the real disaster was just beginning. Because security was about to arrive, and Alicia Brooks was about to reveal exactly who she was and why the people who had discriminated against her were about to lose everything. Airport security arrived in the form of Officer Janet Thompson and her partner, Officer Mike Rodriguez, the same team that had responded to the check-in incident. They boarded the aircraft with the weary professionalism of people who had seen every possible passenger dispute and expected this to be just another routine problem to solve. But the moment they stepped into the first-class cabin, they could feel the tension. Passengers were recording with their phones, 2 people were live streaming, and the energy in the confined space was electric with barely contained conflict. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Thompson asked, looking between Victoria and Alicia with the neutral expression of someone determined to get facts before making judgments. Victoria straightened her uniform and put on her most professional voice. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. We have a passenger who appears to be traveling on fraudulent credentials. She's refusing to move to her correct seat and has been disruptive to other passengers." Officer Thompson looked at Alicia, who was standing quietly in the same spot she had occupied throughout the entire confrontation. "Ma'am, you seem pretty calm for someone who's supposedly being disruptive." "What's your side of the story? I have a valid boarding pass for seat 1A, Alicia replied calmly. "I've asked multiple times for the flight crew to scan my boarding pass and verify my reservation, but they've refused to do so. Instead, they've made assumptions about my ability to afford this ticket based on my appearance and race." Officer Rodriguez frowned. "Ma'am, we actually dealt with you earlier at the check-in counter, didn't we? With a supervisor who made similar accusations. You did. That situation was resolved when it was determined that my credentials were valid and that the accusations were based on discriminatory profiling." Victoria's face went pale. She hadn't realized that this passenger had already been through a discrimination incident that morning, or that security had already verified her credentials once. I wasn't aware of any previous incident." "Maybe you should have been," Officer Thompson said dryly. "Ma'am," she said to Alicia, "may I see your boarding pass and identification?" Alicia handed over her driver's license and held up her phone with the digital boarding pass clearly displayed. Officer Thompson examined both, then looked at Victoria expectantly. "Miss Ashford, do you have a scanner to verify this passenger's reservation?" Victoria hesitated. She had been so certain of her assumptions, so confident in her prejudice, that she hadn't considered what would happen when those assumptions were proven wrong. Yes, but I can tell just by looking that there's been some kind of mistake. Scan it, please." The request was polite, but carried the weight of authority. Victoria had no choice but to pull the handheld scanner from her belt and point it at Alicia's phone screen. The device beeped once, and a green light flashed. Passenger Brooks Alicia. Seat 1A, status priority VIP, special handling required. The reading appeared on Victoria's scanner screen, visible to everyone nearby. Officer Thompson looked at the display, then at Victoria with an expression of professional disappointment. "Miss Ashford, this passenger's credentials are valid. Her seat assignment is correct." What exactly is the problem here? Victoria stared at the scanner as if it had betrayed her. The evidence was right there, undeniable and clear, but she still couldn't process that her assumptions had been completely wrong. But look at her," Victoria stammered. "She doesn't look like she belongs in first class." Officer Rodriguez stepped closer to Victoria, his voice carrying a warning. "Miss Ashford, you just admitted to discriminating against a passenger based on her appearance. Do you understand that what you're describing is illegal?" Richard Blackwood, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease, decided to insert himself into the situation. "Officers, I think you're misunderstanding what happened here. This woman has been disruptive and argumentative throughout this entire process. The flight attendant was just trying to maintain order and security. Officer Thompson turned to face him. And you are Richard Blackwood, Seat 2A. I'm a frequent flyer with this airline, and I can tell you that this kind of behavior is exactly what's wrong with air travel today. What kind of behavior? Richard gestured toward Alicia with obvious disdain. Passengers who try to cause problems and then claim discrimination when they're held to reasonable standards. What standards? Appropriate dress. Proper conduct, basic respect for the premium cabin experience. Officer Thompson looked at Alicia, who was still standing quietly, speaking calmly, and showing no signs of the disruptive behavior Richard was describing. Sir, this passenger appears to be conducting herself appropriately. She's spoken respectfully, complied with requests for identification, and hasn't raised her voice or caused any kind of disturbance. Well, she's being argumentative about her seat assignment. Her seat assignment that we've just verified as correct. Richard's mouth opened and closed as he realized he had just undermined his own argument. But instead of backing down, instead of recognizing that he might be wrong, he doubled down on his prejudice. Look, I don't care what that computer says. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I know what a first-class passenger looks like. She doesn't belong here, and everyone can see it. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Around the cabin, passengers were recording every word. James Peterson's live stream had gained over 3,000 viewers. Comments were exploding across social media platforms, and Richard Blackwood was destroying his own reputation one sentence at a time. Marcus Williams stood up again from his seat in economy. Officer, I'm an attorney, and I want to state for the record that what we're witnessing is clear-cut discrimination. This passenger has been subjected to different treatment based solely on her race and appearance. Stay out of this, Richard snapped. This is between the flight crew and a passenger who's trying to scam her way into first class. Actually, Sir Officer Thompson interjected. This is a legal matter now. Federal law prohibits discrimination in air travel based on race, and we have multiple witnesses documenting exactly that kind of discrimination. Victoria was beginning to panic. The situation was spiraling out of control. The evidence was clearly against her, and she was starting to realize that her career might be in jeopardy. Officers, I was just following standard security procedures. When passengers don't match the profile of typical first-class travelers, we're supposed to verify their credentials. You were supposed to verify her credentials. Officer Rodriguez said, which you could have done by scanning her boarding pass. Instead, you refused to scan it and made assumptions based on her appearance. I was protecting the integrity of the first-class cabin. From what Victoria struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound overtly racist. From inappropriate passengers who might disrupt the experience for other travelers. What made this passenger inappropriate? And there it was, the question that would force Victoria to either admit her prejudice or continue lying in front of witnesses and cameras. She chose poorly. She's dressed inappropriately. She doesn't act like she understands first-class etiquette. And she became argumentative when I tried to redirect her to her proper seat. Her proper seat being 1A in first class, which we've now verified is correct. Victoria's silence was damning. Even she could hear how her arguments sounded when reflected back to her. That was when Derek Morrison appeared at the aircraft door. The check-in supervisor, who had been suspended pending investigation, had somehow talked his way past security and made his way to the plane, apparently determined to support Victoria's accusations. Officers. I'm glad you're here, Derek said breathlessly as he boarded the aircraft. I tried to warn you about this passenger at check-in. She's been running some kind of scam all morning, trying to use fraudulent credentials to access services she hasn't paid for. Officer Thompson turned to face him with obvious exasperation. Mr. Morrison, you were suspended pending investigation. You're not supposed to be in this area. I know, but I couldn't let this fraud get away with it. She probably has accomplices waiting to meet her in Miami. This is clearly part of some larger operation. Derek's conspiracy theories were so ridiculous that even Richard looked uncomfortable. But Derek wasn't done making things worse. Officers, you need to understand, people like her have been targeting airlines for months. They use stolen credit card information to book tickets, create fake boarding passes, and then cry discrimination when they get caught. It's an organized scam, and she's probably just one member of a larger network. The silence that followed Derek's rant was deafening. Even Victoria looked embarrassed by his wild accusations. Officer Rodriguez was making notes in his incident report. And Alicia Brooks stood perfectly calm, watching her tormentors dig their own graves with every word. Mr. Morrison, Officer Thompson said slowly, "You just accused this passenger of credit card fraud, identity theft, and being part of a criminal conspiracy. Do you have any evidence to support these accusations? Just look at her. Does she look like she can afford first class? That's not evidence, sir, that's prejudice." Derek's face flushed red. "I've been working in this industry for 12 years. I know suspicious behavior when I see it. What you see is a black woman in casual clothes, and you've assumed she's a criminal based on that observation alone. That's not... I didn't say anything about race. You didn't have to. Your actions spoke louder than words. Around the cabin, passengers were recording every word of Derek's meltdown. His conspiracy theories and obvious prejudice were being broadcast live to thousands of viewers. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination was trending nationally. And somewhere in corporate offices, executives were watching their company's reputation crumble in real time. But the disaster wasn't over yet, because Alicia Brooks was about to reveal exactly who she was, and the people who had discriminated against her were about to learn what real power looked like. Jessica Williams, the young flight attendant who had watched this entire confrontation unfold, finally found her courage. "Miss Ashford," she said quietly, "maybe we should just apologize to Miss Brooks and get the flight ready for departure." Victoria spun around to face her subordinate with fury. "Jessica, I told you to go check on economy passengers. This situation doesn't concern you." "But she's right," Jessica replied, her voice growing stronger. "We should have just scanned her boarding pass from the beginning. All of this could have been avoided if we had just done our job professionally. Are you questioning my authority? I'm questioning your judgment." The rebellion from her own crew member was the last straw for Victoria. She had been challenged by the passenger, embarrassed by security, undermined by witnesses, and now her own subordinate was publicly questioning her decisions. Her carefully controlled mask of professional competence finally cracked completely. "Fine," Victoria shouted loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "You want me to treat her like she belongs here. You want me to pretend that someone dressed like a college student deserves first-class service. You want me to ignore everything I know about proper standards and customer profiling." The words echoed through the cabin like a confession. Victoria had just admitted to profiling customers based on appearance. She had revealed the ugly prejudice that had driven every decision she'd made that morning, and she had done it in front of dozens of witnesses and live-streaming cameras. Officer Thompson was already reaching for her handcuffs. "Miss Ashford, you just confessed to discriminating against passengers based on their appearance and race. You're under arrest for violating federal civil rights laws." But before she could move, Alicia's phone rang. She answered it calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. "Yes, Margaret. Yes, I heard every word of their confessions. Yes, Victoria Ashford just admitted to customer profiling based on race and appearance. Yes, Derek Morrison just accused me of being part of a criminal conspiracy. And yes, Richard Blackwood has made multiple statements confirming that his objections are based solely on my appearance." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the call. "Please proceed with immediate termination paperwork for both airline employees. Please prepare a permanent no-fly ban for Mr. Blackwood. And please contact the FBI about potential civil rights violations." She ended the call and looked at the three people who had spent the last hour trying to humiliate and diminish her. Her voice remained perfectly calm, but now it carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "My name is Alicia Brooks. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Holdings, the parent company that acquired SkyElite Airways 2 months ago. As of this morning, I own this airline, this aircraft, and your employment contracts." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the hum of the aircraft's electrical systems. Victoria's face went white as bone. Derek stumbled backward as if he'd been hit. Richard's mouth fell open in shock, and around the cabin passengers were recording the moment when prejudice met its reckoning. "Miss Ashford, you're fired. Mr. Morrison, you're fired. Mr. Blackwood, you're banned from flying with any Meridian Holdings subsidiary for life. And all three of you are about to become the subject of federal civil rights investigations." The revelation hit the cabin like an earthquake. Everything that had seemed fixed and certain was suddenly overturned. The power dynamics that had driven the entire confrontation were revealed to be based on false assumptions and toxic prejudice. The people who thought they held all the cards were about to lose everything. And Alicia Brooks, the woman they had dismissed and humiliated based on her appearance, was revealed to be the most powerful person in the entire situation. The live streams exploded with comments. Social media erupted with shares and reactions. News outlets began reaching out for interviews. And somewhere in the depths of the internet, the story of how prejudice destroyed 3 lives in real time was becoming legend. But the confrontation wasn't over yet, because the people who had spent an hour attacking Alicia Brooks were about to learn that actions have consequences, and that in the modern world, those consequences can be swift, public, and permanent. The cabin remained frozen in shocked silence as the full weight of Alicia's revelation settled over everyone. Victoria Ashford, who had spent her entire adult life trading on her beauty and using her authority to diminish others, stood paralyzed as she realized that she had just destroyed her career in the most public way possible. Derek Morrison, the veteran airline employee who thought his experience gave him the right to profile passengers, looked like he was about to be sick. And Richard Blackwood, the entitled businessman who believed his wealth made him superior to others, was staring at Alicia as if she were a ghost. That's impossible," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the aircraft systems. "You're lying. You're just trying to scare us because you got caught." Alicia pulled out her corporate identification card and held it up for everyone to see. The Meridian Holdings logo was clearly visible along with her photo and title, Chief Executive Officer. She then pulled out a folder of documents from her carry-on bag documents that she had brought specifically for this assessment. Meridian Holdings acquired SkyElite Airways for $2.3 billion on May 15th of this year. She said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. The acquisition was completed specifically because of declining service ratings and mounting discrimination complaints. "I'm here today conducting a personal assessment of how SkyElite employees treat passengers who don't fit their preconceived notions of who belongs in first class." She opened the folder and pulled out official documents with corporate seals and signatures. "These are the acquisition papers. These are my appointment letters as CEO. And this," she held up her phone, "contains recordings of everything that has happened this morning, from the check-in counter to this moment." Officer Thompson examined the documents quickly and nodded to her partner. "Ma'am, these appear to be legitimate. Mr. Morrison, Miss Ashford, you're both in a lot of trouble." Derek Morrison was shaking his head in denial, unable to process what was happening. "This is some kind of elaborate scam. She probably printed fake documents. Rich people don't dress like that. CEOs don't fly alone without assistance or security." "Actually," Alicia replied calmly, "CEOs who want to see how their employees really treat customers often travel incognito. It's called mystery shopping, and it's a common practice in the hospitality industry." Richard Blackwood was still staring at her in shock, but his mind was beginning to work again, and he was starting to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Even if you are who you say you are," he said desperately, "I was just supporting the flight crew in maintaining proper standards. I didn't discriminate against anyone, Mr. Blackwood," Alicia said, turning her calm gaze on him in the past hour. "You have made multiple statements indicating that you believe a person's worth can be determined by their clothing, that people who dress casually don't belong in first class, and that someone's appearance indicates their financial status. All of these statements were recorded by multiple witnesses and broadcast live on social media. She pulled up James Peterson's livestream on her phone and showed Richard the viewer count, which had climbed to over 5,000 people. Comments were scrolling by faster than anyone could read them, and the hashtag SkyElite discrimination was trending across multiple platforms. Your statements are now part of the permanent record, Mr. Blackwood. They've been seen by thousands of people, recorded by multiple devices, and documented by law enforcement. There's no taking them back. Richard's face was turning red with panic and embarrassment. I was trying to help maintain order. I fly this route every month, and I know how things are supposed to work. And how are things supposed to work? Well, properly dressed passengers, appropriate behavior, maintaining the standards that make first class a premium experience. Standards based on what Richard struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound discriminatory. Based on proper etiquette and appearance and the kind of behavior you'd expect from people who can afford premium service. Behavior like standing quietly, speaking respectfully, and asking only that crew members do their job professionally. That's not what I meant. What did you mean? Richard realized he was trapped. Every answer he could give would only make him sound worse. He had revealed his true character in front of hundreds of witnesses, and now he was trying to backtrack from statements that had already been broadcast around the world. Victoria was having her own breakdown. The beautiful, confident flight attendant who had believed her appearance and authority made her untouchable was staring at the destruction of everything she had built her life on. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "I was following procedures. When passengers don't look like they belong in first class, we're supposed to verify their credentials. By refusing to scan their boarding pass by using our judgment to assess potential security risks. Security risks based on what criteria? Victoria's mouth opened and closed as she struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound overtly racist. But there was no good answer because her entire approach had been based on racial profiling and socioeconomic prejudice. Based on experience and training and professional judgment about passenger behavior patterns. Passenger behavior patterns that correlate with people who don't typically fly first class, and you determine who typically flies first class, how Victoria was trapped in the same logical cage that had caught Richard. Every answer she could give would only confirm that her decisions had been based on prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns. Derek Morrison was still trying to convince himself that this was all an elaborate hoax. Look, even if you are some kind of executive, that doesn't change the fact that you were acting suspiciously. You refused to provide proper identification, you became argumentative when questioned, and you tried to intimidate staff with threats about legal action. Mr. Morrison, Officer Thompson interjected. "I was present for most of these interactions. This passenger provided identification when requested, remained calm throughout multiple confrontations, and only mentioned legal action after being subjected to discrimination. But she was dressed inappropriately for first class. According to what dress code?" Derek gestured wildly at Alicia's casual attire. "Look at her hoodies and jeans in first class. Come on. You know, that's not appropriate for premium service, actually," Alicia said quietly. "SkyElite Airways has no published dress code for passengers. Your objections to my clothing are based on your personal prejudices, not company policy." Derek's face went white as he realized he had been making up rules to justify his discrimination. Well, there should be a dress code. First class is supposed to be exclusive. Exclusive of what or whom? And there it was again, the question that forced Derek to either admit his prejudice or continue lying in front of witnesses. He chose to keep digging. Exclusive of people who don't appreciate the premium experience, who don't understand how to behave in an upscale environment, who think they can just walk in off the street and expect 5-star service. People like me. People who try to scam their way into situations they haven't earned. And you determined that I was scamming based on what evidence? Based on the obvious fact that you don't belong in first class. Derek had just confessed to discrimination in the clearest possible terms. He had admitted that his objections were based not on any evidence of wrongdoing, but on his assumption that certain people belonged in certain places and that he had the right to enforce those boundaries. Around the cabin, passengers were recording every word of Derek's meltdown. His prejudice and ignorance were being broadcast live to thousands of viewers. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination was trending internationally. And somewhere in corporate offices, executives who had never heard of Derek Morrison were watching him destroy their company's reputation in real time. Jessica Williams, the young flight attendant who had tried to de-escalate the situation, stepped forward with trembling hands. "Miss Brooks, I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I knew this was wrong from the beginning, but I was too scared of losing my job to challenge Miss Ashford's authority." Alicia looked at Jessica with compassion. "Jessica, you're not responsible for your supervisor's behavior, but you are responsible for your own choices going forward. I understand, and I want you to know that not all of us think like they do. Some of us became flight attendants because we wanted to help people and provide good service to everyone, regardless of what they look like. I appreciate your honesty, Jessica, and I want you to know that employees who demonstrate integrity and professionalism will have opportunities for advancement in the new SkyElite organization." Victoria heard the implication and felt a stab of panic. "Wait, you can't fire me based on one incident. I've been with this airline for 8 years. I have seniority. I have rights." "Miss Ashford," Alicia replied calmly, "you have the right to be treated fairly by your employer. You do not have the right to discriminate against passengers based on their race or appearance. You violated federal civil rights laws, company policies, and basic human decency. I never mentioned race. I never said anything about race. You didn't have to. Your actions spoke louder than words." Richard Blackwood was beginning to understand the full scope of his disaster. "Look, maybe I spoke hastily. Maybe I made some poor choices in how I expressed myself. But surely we can work this out quietly without making a big public scene. Mr. Blackwood, you made this a public scene when you stood up in front of a cabin full of recording passengers and declared that I didn't belong in first class based on my appearance. You made it public when you accused me of fraud and theft without any evidence. You made it public when you revealed your belief that certain people belong in certain places and that you have the right to enforce those boundaries." She gestured toward the phones that were still recording throughout the cabin. "This story is already public, Mr. Blackwood. It's been viewed by thousands of people, shared across social media platforms, and picked up by news outlets. There's no putting this genie back in the bottle." Derek Morrison was still in denial, but his desperation was beginning to show. "This is entrapment. You deliberately dressed down and acted suspiciously to provoke a response. You were trying to trick us into discriminating against you. Mr. Morrison, I was dressed casually and behaved politely throughout every interaction. If you consider those things suspicious or provocative, that says more about your prejudices than it does about my behavior. But you were recording us. You were gathering evidence to use against us. I was documenting how SkyElite employees treat passengers who don't fit their preconceived notions. The fact that you consider fair treatment to be a threat suggests that you know your behavior was inappropriate." Officer Thompson was filling out her incident report, documenting every confession and admission that the 3 discriminators had made. "Miss Brooks, do you want to press formal charges against any of these individuals?" Alicia considered the question carefully. "I want to ensure that they face appropriate consequences for their actions, but I also want to focus on preventing future incidents rather than just punishing past behavior." She turned to address the entire cabin, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just revealed herself to be the most powerful person in the room. What happened here today wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a culture that allows prejudice to masquerade as professionalism. Starting today, that culture ends. Her phone rang again. She answered it calmly. "Yes, Margaret. Yes, proceed with the immediate terminations. Yes, contact the FAA about implementing new anti-discrimination training requirements. And yes, schedule a press conference for this afternoon." She ended the call and looked at Victoria, Derek, and Richard with the same steady gaze that had unnerved them throughout the entire confrontation. "Miss Ashford, Mr. Morrison, your employment with SkyElite Airways is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises and you will receive final paperwork within 24 hours. You can't fire me, Victoria shrieked, her composure finally cracking completely. I have a contract, I have seniority, I have rights. You had a contract, Alicia corrected, which you voided when you discriminated against passengers based on their race. You had seniority which you forfeited when you violated federal civil rights laws, and you have rights which you chose to ignore when you denied them to others. Derek was shaking his head in disbelief. 12 years. 12 years of loyal service, and you're throwing it away because of one misunderstanding. Mr. Morrison, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. You chose to assume I was a criminal based on my appearance. You chose to refuse to verify my credentials. You chose to escalate the situation rather than do your job professionally, and now you're choosing to face the consequences. Richard Blackwood was frantically pulling out his phone. I'm calling my lawyer. This is defamation. This is harassment. You can't destroy someone's reputation based on a few comments taken out of context. Mr. Blackwood, your comments weren't taken out of context. They were recorded in their entirety and broadcast live to thousands of viewers. Your reputation wasn't destroyed by me, it was destroyed by your own words and actions. The cabin fell silent again as the full weight of what had just happened settled over everyone. 3 people had walked into this confrontation believing they held all the power, confident in their prejudices, secure in their assumptions about who belonged where, and who had the right to make those determinations. In the span of an hour, they had been revealed as examples of everything wrong with discriminatory thinking. They had confessed to their prejudices in front of hundreds of witnesses. They had been fired, banned, and made infamous, and their downfall had been broadcast live to the world. But the story wasn't over yet, because Alicia Brooks was about to show that true power doesn't come from the ability to diminish others, it comes from the capacity to lift them up. The transformation of the aircraft cabin was immediate and dramatic. Where moments before there had been conflict and tension, now there was a strange mixture of shock, vindication, and uncertainty about what would happen next. Alicia Brooks stood in the center of what had become an impromptu courtroom, watching as the full weight of consequences settled on the people who had discriminated against her. Victoria Ashford was no longer the confident, beautiful authority figure who had controlled the cabin just minutes earlier. Her perfect makeup was beginning to smudge as tears of panic and rage started to flow. Her elegant uniform, which had been a symbol of her power and status, now looked like a costume she was no longer entitled to wear. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking with a combination of fury and desperation. "I'm going to sue you for wrongful termination. I'm going to sue the airline. I'm going to sue everyone involved in this setup." "Miss," Ashford Officer Thompson interjected, "you might want to focus on the criminal charges you're about to face rather than civil lawsuits you can't win." Derek Morrison was equally distraught, but his reaction was different. Where Victoria was angry, Derek seemed broken. 12 years in the airline industry, and it was all ending because he couldn't see past his own prejudice. "My wife is going to kill me," he muttered, staring at the floor. "We just bought a house. Our daughter starts college next year. How am I going to explain this? How am I going to find another job? Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to discriminate against passengers," Marcus Williams said from his seat in economy. "Actions have consequences, and you chose your actions." Richard Blackwood was frantically making phone calls, trying to reach his lawyer, his business partners, anyone who might be able to help him contain the damage. But even as he spoke, he could see his social media notifications exploding with tags and mentions as the video of his discriminatory statements spread across the internet. "This is going to destroy my business," he said into his phone. "I need crisis management. I need media control. I need—" He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "What do you mean, you can't represent me? What do you mean it's a conflict of interest?" Alicia watched their individual meltdowns with the calm observation of someone who had seen the consequences of prejudice before. She felt no pleasure in their downfall, but she also felt no sympathy. These were not victims of circumstance. They were people who had chosen to discriminate and were now facing the natural consequences of those choices. Her phone rang again. This time it was Thomas Patterson, her CFO. Thomas, perfect timing. Yes, I want immediate implementation of the new protocols. Contact all department heads and schedule emergency training sessions. And please make sure the media knows that we're taking swift action to address discrimination in our operations." She listened for a moment, then continued. "Also, I want Jessica Williams promoted to head purser on this flight effective immediately. She showed courage in speaking up when it mattered, and we need to reward that kind of integrity." Jessica Williams, who'd been standing quietly near the galley, looked up in shock. "Miss Brooks, I don't know what to say. Say you'll help us create a culture where every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background." "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." Alicia ended the call and addressed the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize for the disruption to your travel experience. What you witnessed today was unacceptable, and it represents everything that SkyElite Airways is committed to changing." She paused, looking around at the passengers who had recorded the entire confrontation. "I also want to thank those of you who documented what happened. Transparency and accountability are the only ways to ensure that discrimination doesn't happen again." James Peterson, who had been live-streaming the entire confrontation, raised his hand slightly. "Miss Brooks, my stream has been viewed by over 8,000 people. Do you have any message for them?" Alicia considered the question carefully. She knew that whatever she said next would be recorded and shared, that it would become part of the permanent record of this incident. "I want everyone to understand that what happened here today wasn't just about one airline or 3 individuals," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin and into the thousands of devices recording her words. "This was about a culture that has allowed prejudice to masquerade as professionalism for too long." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Discrimination doesn't just hurt the people who are targeted, it damages everyone. It creates a society where people are judged by their appearance rather than their character, where assumptions take the place of evidence, where prejudice is mistaken for wisdom." The cabin was absolutely silent as she spoke. Even Victoria, Derek, and Richard had stopped their individual dramas to listen. Starting today, SkyElite Airways will be an airline where every passenger is treated with dignity and respect. We will not tolerate discrimination in any form. We will not allow prejudice to determine how our customers are served. And we will hold ourselves accountable to the highest standards of professionalism and human decency. She looked directly into James Peterson's camera. "To everyone watching this, you have the power to demand better. You have the right to be treated fairly regardless of how you look or where you come from, and you have the responsibility to speak up when you see discrimination happening to others." The impromptu speech was interrupted by the arrival of additional security personnel and what appeared to be corporate representatives from SkyElite. They boarded the aircraft quickly and efficiently, clearly having been briefed on the situation. Miss Brooks, said a woman in a business suit who appeared to be in charge of the corporate response team, "I'm Sarah Richardson, Vice President of Operations. We have termination paperwork prepared and legal representatives standing by." "Excellent. Please ensure that both terminated employees are escorted from the premises immediately and that their access to all company systems is revoked." Victoria overheard the conversation and made one last desperate attempt to save her career. "Wait, you can't do this. I was following procedures. I was protecting the integrity of the first-class cabin. I was Miss Ashford," Alicia interrupted calmly. "You were discriminating against passengers based on their race and appearance. You've confessed to this discrimination in front of hundreds of witnesses and thousands of online viewers. Your employment is terminated, and your actions are being referred to federal authorities for civil rights violations." Derek Morrison was led away quietly, his head hanging in shame. He had destroyed his career and his family's financial security because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. The man who had spent 12 years in the airline industry was leaving it in disgrace, recorded and broadcast for the world to see. Richard Blackwood was still on his phone, frantically trying to control the damage to his reputation and business interests. But the video of his discriminatory statements was already viral, shared across social media platforms, and picked up by news outlets. His investment firm would likely fire him within hours. His social standing was destroyed, and his name would forever be associated with the kind of prejudice that most people claimed no longer existed. As the three discriminators were escorted from the aircraft, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. The tension that had dominated the space for the past hour was dissipating, replaced by a strange sense of catharsis and justice. "Excuse me," said an elderly woman from seat 4B, her voice wavering with emotion. "I want you to know that I'm ashamed of how long I sat silent while that young lady was being mistreated. I should have spoken up sooner." "Ma'am," Alicia replied gently, "the important thing is that you recognize it was wrong. That awareness is the first step toward change." Marcus Williams stood up again, his lawyer's instincts engaged. "Miss Brooks, I want to offer my services if you need legal support for the civil rights aspects of this case. What happened here today was textbook discrimination, and the perpetrators should face the full consequences of their actions. Thank you, Mr. Williams. We'll be in touch." Sarah Richardson was coordinating with the aircraft crew to prepare for departure. "Miss Brooks, we have a replacement crew standing by if needed, but Jessica Williams and the other flight attendants are prepared to continue service if you're comfortable with that." Alicia looked at Jessica, who was standing straighter now, her nervousness replaced by determination. "Jessica, how do you feel about leading this crew for the remainder of the flight, honored ma'am? And committed to making sure every passenger receives excellent service. Then let's continue to Miami." As the aircraft prepared for departure, Alicia settled into seat 1A, the seat that Victoria Ashford had insisted she didn't deserve, the seat that Derek Morrison had claimed was fraudulently obtained, the seat that Richard Blackwood had declared she didn't belong in. She looked out the window at the Chicago skyline and reflected on the morning's events. In the span of 2 hours, she had exposed the depth of discrimination within her own company, fired 2 employees who had violated basic human decency, banned a passenger who thought his wealth entitled him to treat others as inferior, and sent a message that prejudice would not be tolerated under her leadership. But, more importantly, she had demonstrated that power and authority came with the responsibility to protect the dignity of everyone, especially those who society might consider powerless. Jessica Williams approached with a crystal glass of champagne and a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Brooks. Is there anything I can get for you? Just a commitment that every passenger on every flight will receive this same level of respect and professionalism. You have it, ma'am, from all of us. As SkyElite Flight 447 pushed back from the gate and began its journey to Miami, the story of what had happened in first class was already spreading around the world. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination was trending globally. News outlets were reaching out for interviews, and somewhere in corporate boardrooms across the aviation industry, executives were reviewing their own policies and training programs, wondering if their companies were next. The flight itself was smooth and professional. Jessica Williams and her crew provided excellent service to every passenger, treating each person with the dignity and respect they deserved. The atmosphere in the cabin was lighter somehow, as if the removal of the toxic prejudice had allowed everyone to breathe more freely. But the real impact of the morning's events was only beginning to be felt. Because Alicia Brooks had done more than fire 3 people, she had created a moment of accountability that would ripple through the airline industry and beyond. By the time SkyElite Flight 447 touched down in Miami at 1:15 p.m., the story of what had happened in first class had exploded across the internet with the force of a digital hurricane. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination was trending #1 worldwide on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. News outlets from CNN to the BBC were running breaking news segments, and Alicia Brooks was about to discover that her decision to conduct an undercover assessment had created a cultural moment that extended far beyond airline policy. As passengers disembarked, many stopped to speak with Alicia personally. Marcus Williams handed her his business card. "Miss Brooks, if you need any legal support for the civil rights aspects of this case, please don't hesitate to call. What happened today was wrong, but your response was exemplary." James Peterson, whose live stream had been viewed by over 15,000 people during the flight, approached with obvious excitement. Miss Brooks, my video has been shared over 50,000 times already. People are calling it a masterclass in how to handle discrimination with dignity and power. I appreciate that, but I hope the real lesson people take away is that everyone deserves to be treated with respect regardless of their position or authority. The elderly woman from seat 4B, who had introduced herself as Margaret Davis, stopped to speak as well. Dear, I want you to know that you've inspired this old lady to speak up the next time I see someone being treated unfairly. I've been too comfortable staying silent for too long. Mrs. Davis, that means more to me than you can possibly know. As Alicia walked through Miami International Airport, she was recognized by passengers and airport employees who had already seen the viral videos. Some approached for selfies, others simply nodded their appreciation, and a few airport workers thanked her for standing up against discrimination. Her phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the flight, with calls from reporters, requests for interviews, and messages from corporate communications teams trying to manage the rapidly expanding story. By the time she reached the airport exit, she had missed calls from the Today Show, Good Morning America, 60 Minutes, and a dozen other major news programs. Outside the terminal, a small crowd of reporters had already gathered. Somehow, word of her arrival had leaked, and the media was ready with cameras and microphones. Alicia paused, realizing that whatever she said next would be recorded and broadcast around the world. Miss Brooks, shouted several reporters simultaneously. Can you tell us what happened on the flight? Are you planning to sue? What changes are you implementing at SkyElite? Alicia held up her hand for quiet, and the crowd fell silent with the respect accorded to someone who had just become a symbol of justice, standing up to prejudice. What happened today on SkyElite Flight 447 was unacceptable. She began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. 3 individuals chose to discriminate against me based on my race and appearance. They assumed that because I was a young black woman dressed casually, I couldn't possibly belong in first class. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But this story isn't really about me. It's about the thousands of passengers who face discrimination, everyday passengers who don't have the power or platform to demand accountability. It's about the culture that allows prejudice to masquerade as professionalism. What actions are you taking against the employees involved? Called out a reporter from CNN. The employees who discriminated against passengers have been terminated immediately. The passenger who supported and encouraged their discrimination has been permanently banned from flying with any Meridian Holdings subsidiary, and we are cooperating fully with federal authorities regarding potential civil rights violations. Are you planning to sue for damages? Asked another reporter. This was never about money or personal restitution. This was about exposing a culture of discrimination and implementing changes to ensure it never happens again. SkyElite Airways will be implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination training, new accountability measures, and a zero-tolerance policy for prejudice in any form. What message do you have for other passengers who might face similar discrimination? Alicia looked directly into the cameras, knowing that her words would be heard by millions of people around the world. Document everything. Speak up when it's safe to do so. Demand accountability. And remember that your dignity and worth as a human being are not determined by what you're wearing or what you look like. She paused, then added, and to the people in positions of authority, whether you're a flight attendant, a manager, a security guard, or a CEO, remember that power comes with responsibility. The responsibility to treat everyone with dignity and respect, especially those who society might consider powerless. Miss Brooks, some people are saying you entrapped the employees by dressing down deliberately. How do you respond to that? I was dressed casually but appropriately. If airline employees consider casual clothing suspicious or provocative, that reveals more about their prejudices than it does about my choices. Every passenger, regardless of how they're dressed, deserves professional service and basic human dignity. As she finished the impromptu press conference, her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Patterson. Stock up 12% since the story broke. Board unanimously supports your actions. Media requests flooding in from around the world. The economic impact was already being felt. Despite initial concerns about negative publicity, investors were responding positively to SkyElite's swift action against discrimination. The company's stock price was rising as the market rewarded decisive leadership and principled decision-making. But the real impact was measured in the thousands of comments, shares, and testimonials pouring in from people who had experienced similar discrimination. Social media was filling with stories of passengers who had been profiled, questioned, or humiliated based on their appearance. The conversation Alicia had sparked was opening up decades of suppressed experiences and long overdue accountability. The emergency board meeting at Meridian Holdings headquarters in New York was unlike any corporate gathering in the company's history. Every board member had seen the viral videos. Every executive had fielded calls from reporters, and everyone understood that they were witnessing a watershed moment that would define their company's future. Alicia participated via video conference from Miami, still wearing the same casual hoodie and jeans that had triggered the morning's discrimination. The juxtaposition wasn't lost on anyone. The most powerful person in the room was dressed like a college student, while the executives in expensive suits were hanging on her every word. The first question we need to address, Alicia began, is whether this was an isolated incident or a pattern of behavior. Based on my preliminary review of complaint records, this appears to be part of a broader cultural problem. Thomas Patterson, the CFO, pulled up data on his laptop. I've been reviewing customer service complaints from the past 2 years. We have 127 documented incidents of passengers claiming discriminatory treatment, with 89% of those complaints involving passengers of color. How many of those complaints resulted in employee discipline? 12, and of those, only 3 resulted in termination. The silence in the conference room was damning. SkyElite Airways had been tolerating discrimination complaints, allowing prejudiced employees to continue serving passengers and creating a culture where bias was tolerated as long as it wasn't too obvious. Margaret, Alicia said, addressing her chief legal officer, "What's our potential liability exposure significant?" Each of those 127 complaints represents a potential civil rights violation. The Department of Justice could initiate a pattern and practice investigation. The NAACP has already issued a statement calling for a federal probe. And class action lawyers are circling. Good. We deserve scrutiny. We've allowed this culture to persist, and now we need to face the consequences while implementing real change. The board members exchanged nervous glances. Most corporate executives would be focused on limiting liability and controlling damage. Alicia was talking about embracing accountability and welcoming federal oversight. "What specific changes are you proposing?" asked Dr. Sarah Williams, the board's Ethics and Compliance Chair. Complete overhaul of customer service training with mandatory anti-bias education for all passenger-facing employees. Implementation of real-time complaint tracking with immediate escalation protocols. Third-party auditing of service practices across all operations. And zero tolerance for discrimination with immediate termination for confirmed violations. "That's going to be expensive," noted Robert Martinez, the operations director. "Discrimination lawsuits are more expensive. Damaged reputation is more expensive. Losing customers because they don't feel safe flying with us is more expensive." She was right, and everyone knew it. The cost of implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination training and oversight would be minimal compared to the potential legal and reputational damage of maintaining the status quo. "I want every employee to understand that we're not just changing policies, we're changing culture," Alicia continued. "This isn't about political correctness or sensitivity training. This is about basic human decency and professional competence." "What about the media response?" asked Jennifer Liu, the corporate communications director. "Full transparency. We admit that we had a problem, we explain what we're doing to fix it, and we commit to ongoing accountability. No corporate speak, no evasion, no minimizing what happened. That's a risk. Admitting fault could increase our legal exposure. Denying reality would increase our moral exposure. I'd rather face lawsuits with integrity than avoid them through deception." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Alicia outlining a comprehensive transformation plan that would touch every aspect of SkyElite's operations. New hiring practices that emphasized emotional intelligence and cultural competency. revised training programs that included real-world scenarios and bias recognition, enhanced complaint procedures that empowered passengers and protected employees who reported discrimination. But perhaps most importantly, she announced the creation of a new position, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, who would report directly to her and have the authority to investigate complaints, impose discipline, and implement changes without interference from other departments. I want someone in this role who has personal experience with discrimination, who understands the impact of bias on real people, and who has the courage to challenge authority when necessary, she said. This isn't going to be a token position or a public relations gesture. This is going to be a senior executive with real power and the mandate to use it. As the meeting concluded, the board members were clear on the path forward. SkyElite Airways was going to become a leader in anti-discrimination practices, not because it was good for public relations, but because it was the right thing to do. The stock market agreed. By the close of trading that day, Meridian Holdings stock had gained 15%, with analysts praising the company's swift action and principled leadership. Investors were betting that companies with strong ethical standards and inclusive cultures would outperform those that clung to outdated practices. But the real measure of success wouldn't be found in stock prices or corporate policies. It would be found in the experiences of individual passengers, people like Marcus Williams, who had witnessed discrimination, people like Jessica Williams, who had found the courage to speak up, and people like the thousands of passengers who flew every day hoping to be treated with dignity and respect. The transformation of SkyElite Airways had begun not in a boardroom or a training manual, but in the first-class cabin of Flight 447, where a young black woman in a hoodie had refused to accept that her appearance determined her worth. And that refusal had changed everything. The immediate aftermath was just the beginning. Because real change doesn't happen in corporate announcements or media interviews, it happens in the daily interactions between human beings and the choices people make when they think no one is watching, and in the courage to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. Alicia Brooks had started a conversation that extended far beyond airline policy. She had created a moment of accountability that would ripple through the travel industry and beyond. And she had demonstrated that true leadership wasn't about commanding respect. It was about demanding justice for everyone, especially those who society might consider powerless. The viral videos from Flight 447 had been viewed millions of times. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination had sparked thousands of testimonials from people sharing their own experiences with bias. And somewhere in airports and airplanes around the world, employees were beginning to think twice before making assumptions about passengers based on their appearance. Change was coming to the airline industry. Not because of regulations or lawsuits, but because one woman had refused to accept discrimination and had the power to do something about it. The question now was whether that change would be lasting, meaningful, and transformative, or whether it would fade into corporate memory like so many other moments of awakening. Alicia Brooks was determined to ensure it would be the former. Because she understood that real power isn't measured by the ability to fire employees or change policies. It's measured by the capacity to create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or status. The immediate aftermath was over. The real work was just beginning. The Atlanta Unemployment Office was crowded on Tuesday morning, filled with the usual mix of people seeking work, filing claims, and attending mandatory job search workshops. In the far corner, hunched over a computer terminal and trying to remain invisible, sat Victoria Ashford. 6 months earlier, she had been the head purser on international flights, commanding attention and respect with her beauty and authority. Now, she was just another unemployed person struggling to find work in an economy that had little patience for people with her particular baggage. Victoria's fall from grace had been swift and merciless. Within hours of her termination from SkyElite, the viral video of her discriminatory behavior had been viewed millions of times. Her name, her face, and her words had become synonymous with workplace prejudice and abuse of authority. What had once been her greatest asset, her striking appearance, had become a liability as people recognized her from the infamous footage. She had applied for over 50 jobs in the past 6 months, flight attendant positions with other airlines, customer service roles, hospitality management, retail sales, anything that might provide a paycheck and a fresh start. But every potential employer conducted internet searches on applicants, and Victoria's search results were a disaster. Victoria Ashford, racist flight attendant. SkyElite discrimination scandal. Flight crew fired for bias. The first page of Google results was filled with articles, videos, and commentary about her behavior on Flight 447. No amount of explaining could overcome the evidence of her own words recorded and broadcast for the world to see. Her personal life had suffered equally. Friends had distanced themselves, embarrassed to be associated with someone who had become internet infamous for the wrong reasons. Her boyfriend of 3 years had broken up with her after his colleagues began making jokes about dating the racist flight attendant. Her family in Tennessee had begged her to come home and lay low until the attention died down. But the attention never died down. The viral video had taken on a life of its own, becoming a teaching tool in diversity training programs, a case study in business schools, and a reference point for discussions about workplace discrimination. Victoria Ashford had become a permanent symbol of what not to do, how not to behave, and why bias training was necessary. The job search computer terminal was slow and frustrating, like everything else in her life had become. She was filling out an application for a retail position at a department store, a job that would pay less in a year than she used to make in a month, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Victoria, is that really you?" She turned to see Jennifer Walsh, a former flight attendant colleague from her early days with SkyElite. Jennifer looked successful and well-dressed, clearly still employed in the industry that Victoria had been cast out of. "Hi, Jennifer," Victoria said quietly, trying to minimize the conversation before anyone else noticed. "I heard what happened, but I couldn't believe it. I mean, you always had strong opinions about passengers, but I never thought you'd—" Jennifer trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I never thought I'd what? Become a viral video, lose my career, become unemployable?" Jennifer shifted nervously. "Look, I'm not judging you, but what you said to that passenger, it was pretty bad, Victoria. And the way you kept doubling down even when it was clear you were wrong. I was doing my job. I was protecting the integrity of the first-class cabin." Even now, 6 months later, Victoria couldn't fully acknowledge the extent of her misconduct. She had convinced herself that she had been following proper procedures, that the passenger had been suspicious, that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion by social media and political correctness. Jennifer looked at her with something between pity and disbelief. "Victoria, you accused a passenger of fraud and theft based on her appearance. You called security on a woman whose only crime was being black and wearing casual clothes. How is that protecting anything except your own prejudices?" The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Even former colleagues who had once laughed at her harsh judgments about passengers were now distancing themselves from her behavior. "You don't understand what it was like," Victoria said defensively. She was acting suspiciously. She didn't look like she belonged in first class. "You were just being racist," Jennifer interrupted. "And now you're unemployed because you couldn't see past your own bias long enough to do your job professionally." Jennifer walked away, leaving Victoria alone with the computer terminal and the harsh reality of her situation. She was 28 years old, attractive, intelligent, and completely unemployable because of choices she had made in one moment of prejudice that had been recorded for posterity. Meanwhile, across the country, in Seattle, Derek Morrison was having his own reckoning with the consequences of his discrimination. His wife had filed for divorce after his behavior became a viral sensation, unable to cope with the humiliation and the impact on their daughter's social life. His house had gone into foreclosure when he couldn't find steady employment. His 12-year career in the airline industry was over-destroyed by assumptions he had made about a passenger's worthiness based on her appearance. Derek was working part-time at a warehouse loading dock, a job that paid a fraction of his former salary, and offered none of the respect or authority he had once enjoyed. His former colleagues avoided him. His neighbors whispered when he walked by. His daughter, now a freshman in college, had changed her last name to her mother's maiden name, to avoid association with his infamy. The worst part wasn't the financial hardship or the social isolation. It was the gradual understanding of how wrong he had been. In quiet moments when he wasn't focused on survival and damage control, Derek found himself replaying the events of that morning and recognizing his prejudice for what it really was. He had assumed that a young black woman in casual clothes couldn't afford first class. He had refused to verify her credentials because he was convinced that his assumptions were more reliable than the airline's computer system. He had escalated the situation because he couldn't admit that he might be wrong about someone based on their appearance. The woman he had discriminated against had turned out to be the CEO of his company, a billionaire entrepreneur who had more wealth and power than Derek could imagine. But that wasn't really the point. Even if she had been exactly who he assumed, she was a young woman of modest means, trying to fly first class. She still would have deserved professional service and basic human dignity. Derek's discrimination had cost him everything: his job, his family, his reputation, his future. But perhaps more importantly, it had cost him his illusions about his own character. He had been forced to confront the ugly truth that he judged people based on their appearance and treated them differently based on those judgments. Richard Blackwood's consequences had been equally devastating but played out in the rarefied world of high finance and social status. His investment firm had fired him within 24 hours of the viral video, citing the reputational damage clause in his partnership agreement. His clients had fled en masse, unwilling to trust their money to someone who had revealed himself to be capable of such poor judgment and obvious prejudice. The exclusive social clubs that had once welcomed his membership quietly asked him to resign. The charity boards that had benefited from his donations politely declined his continued involvement. The Manhattan social circle that had once revolved around wealth and status suddenly found that certain kinds of behavior were beyond redemption regardless of bank account balances. Richard had moved to Florida, where he hoped to rebuild his career and reputation away from the New York financial community that had made him persona non grata. But even in Miami, his past followed him. The viral video had made him nationally recognizable as an example of entitled prejudice, and his attempts to start a new investment firm were met with suspicious questions and declined partnerships. He had tried to rehabilitate his image through charitable donations and public apologies, but the sincerity of his contrition was undermined by lawsuits he had filed against Alicia Brooks' SkyElite Airways, and even some of the passengers who had recorded his discriminatory statements. His legal team had advised him to accept responsibility and focus on rebuilding, but Richard's ego couldn't tolerate the idea that he had been publicly humiliated by someone he had considered inferior. The lawsuits were universally unsuccessful. Courts found no evidence of entrapment defamation or wrongful termination. Richard's own words, recorded by multiple witnesses and broadcast live on social media, provided incontrovertible evidence of his discriminatory behavior. His legal challenges only served to keep the story in the news and remind people of his prejudice and poor judgment. The new SkyElite Airways was barely recognizable as the same company that had employed Victoria Ashford and Derek Morrison 6 months earlier. The transformation had been comprehensive, touching every aspect of operations from hiring practices to customer service protocols to executive accountability. Jessica Williams stood in the crew briefing room at Chicago O'Hare conducting her weekly training session for new flight attendants. As the newly promoted regional customer service manager, she had become one of the faces of SkyElite's cultural transformation. Her story, standing up to discriminatory behavior despite being a junior employee, had become part of the company's training materials and public relations narrative. The most important thing to remember, Jessica told the group of new hires, is that every passenger deserves the same level of professional service regardless of their appearance, age, race, or how much they paid for their ticket. The training room was diverse in a way that the old SkyElite never was. The company's new hiring practices prioritized emotional intelligence and cultural competency alongside traditional qualifications. Every new employee underwent extensive bias training, participated in real-world scenario exercises, and was required to demonstrate understanding of discrimination laws and customer service excellence. "Can anyone tell me what was wrong with the way Miss Ashford handled the passenger in our case study video?" Jessica asked. A young man named Marcus raised his hand. She made assumptions about the passenger's ability to afford first class based on her appearance and then refused to verify the passenger's credentials when asked to do so. Exactly. And what should she have done differently? Treated the passenger with respect, scanned her boarding pass immediately, and provided professional service regardless of her personal opinions about the passenger's appearance. Right. And remember, professional service isn't about agreeing with every passenger or never having private thoughts. It's about not letting your personal biases affect how you do your job. The training materials included the actual footage from Flight 447, with names and faces blurred but dialogue intact. New employees watched Victoria's discrimination unfold in real time, saw the impact on passengers and witnesses, and learned about the swift consequences that followed. It was uncomfortable viewing, but it was effective education. The transformation extended beyond training to actual policy changes. SkyElite had implemented a real-time complaint system that allowed passengers to report discrimination immediately through their mobile app. Complaints were investigated within 24 hours, with findings reported to both the passenger and executive management. Employees who were found to have discriminated faced immediate termination regardless of seniority or performance in other areas. The company had also created a passenger bill of rights that was posted prominently in every airport location and aircraft. The document clearly stated that discrimination based on race, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation, or appearance would not be tolerated and provided specific steps for reporting violations. Perhaps most importantly, SkyElite had hired Dr. Carmen Rodriguez as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, a position that reported directly to Alicia Brooks and had real authority to investigate discipline and implement changes. Dr. Rodriguez had a PhD in organizational psychology and 15 years of experience in civil rights enforcement. She wasn't a token appointment or a public relations gesture. She was a senior executive with the power and mandate to ensure that the old culture never returned. The goal isn't just to avoid viral videos or lawsuits, Dr. Rodriguez explained to the executive team during their monthly review meeting. The goal is to create an environment where every passenger feels welcomed and valued, where every employee understands that discrimination is incompatible with professional excellence. The results were measurable. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by 23% since the implementation of the new policies. Employee turnover had decreased as workers felt more confident about reporting problems and more proud of their workplace culture. Most importantly, discrimination complaints had dropped by 89%, and those that were filed were resolved quickly and transparently. Other airlines had taken notice. The industry publication Airways magazine had featured SkyElite as Airline of the Year for its comprehensive approach to customer service and cultural transformation. Competitors were quietly implementing similar training programs and policy changes, recognizing that passengers increasingly expected airlines to demonstrate commitment to equal treatment and professional service. The financial impact had been equally positive. SkyElite's stock price had outperformed industry averages for 6 consecutive months, as investors recognized the value of strong ethical leadership and inclusive practices. The company had gained market share as passengers chose to fly with an airline they trusted to treat them fairly. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of success came in the individual stories of passengers and employees who experienced the new SkyElite culture firsthand. Marcus Williams, the attorney who had witnessed the original discrimination, had become a regular customer and public advocate for the airline's transformation. James Peterson, whose live stream had helped document the incident, had credited SkyElite with proving that companies can change when leadership is committed to justice. The elderly passenger, Margaret Davis, who had regretted staying silent during the original incident, had written a letter to Alicia Brooks, praising the changes she had observed during subsequent flights. "Your airline now treats every passenger like they matter," she wrote. "That's the way it should always have been, but I'm grateful it's the way it is now." SkyElite Airways had become more than just an airline. It had become a symbol of how quickly and completely, organizational culture could change when leadership was committed to justice and accountability. The company that had once employed discriminatory staff and ignored passenger complaints was now leading the industry in diversity, inclusion, and customer service excellence. The transformation was complete, but the commitment was ongoing. Because lasting change doesn't happen through policies and training programs alone. It happens through daily choices, individual accountability, and the understanding that treating people with dignity and respect isn't just good business practice, it's basic human decency. 18 months after the incident that changed everything, Alicia Brooks found herself on another airplane in another first-class seat looking out at clouds that seemed to stretch forever into the blue expanse of sky. This time, she was flying SkyElite Flight 892 from New York to London, and this time the experience was everything air travel should be: professional, dignified, and completely unremarkable in the best possible way. The flight attendant who greeted her was Elena Santos, a young woman whose warm smile and genuine professionalism represented everything the new SkyElite stood for. Elena didn't know Alicia's identity, didn't recognize her as the CEO who had transformed the company, and didn't need to. She simply provided excellent service because that was who she was and what her training had taught her to do. "Welcome aboard, Miss Brooks," Elena said, checking the passenger manifest. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" "Sparkling water would be perfect, thank you." "Of course. And please let me know if there's anything else you need during the flight." It was such a simple interaction, so ordinary and professional, but it represented everything Alicia had fought to create. No assumptions based on appearance. No special treatment based on perceived status. Just one human being treating another with courtesy and respect. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, Alicia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The viral video from Flight 447 had been viewed over 50 million times. The hashtag SkyElite discrimination had sparked a global conversation about workplace bias and customer service. The three people who had discriminated against her had faced real consequences for their choices. But more importantly, meaningful change had taken root. SkyElite Airways was now recognized as an industry leader in diversity and inclusion. Other companies across multiple sectors had adopted similar training programs and accountability measures. The conversation about discrimination had moved beyond social media trends to become part of corporate governance and business strategy. Victoria Ashford, Derek Morrison, and Richard Blackwood had become cautionary tales, examples of how quickly prejudice could destroy lives and careers in an interconnected world where bad behavior was recorded and shared instantly. Their downfall had been swift and public, but it had also created space for better people to rise and better practices to take hold. Alicia pulled out her tablet and opened her Notes app. She had been invited to give the keynote speech at the International Conference on Workplace Equality, and she wanted to craft words that would capture not just what had happened on Flight 447, but what it meant for the future of how people treat each other. Prejudice, she typed, is the ultimate failure of imagination. It's the inability to see past surface appearances, to recognize the humanity and dignity that exists in every person. When we judge people by their clothes, their accent, their age, or their race, we're not protecting standards, we're revealing our own limitations. She paused, watching clouds drift past the window, thinking about all the people who had been affected by what happened that morning, 18 months ago. The passengers who had found the courage to speak up when they witnessed discrimination. The employees who had learned to examine their own biases and commit to professional excellence. The executives who had discovered that doing the right thing could also be good business. True power, she continued typing, isn't the ability to diminish others based on assumptions and prejudice. True power is the capacity to see the worth in every person, and the courage to defend that worth when it's under attack. It's the understanding that how we treat the people society considers powerless reveals who we really are. The words flowed easily, because they came from lived experience, from the understanding that dignity wasn't something that could be earned or lost based on appearance or status. It was something that belonged to everyone simply because they were human. The person in the hoodie might own your company. The quiet woman in the corner might control your future. The passenger you're about to dismiss might just have the power to change your world. But even if they don't, even if they're exactly who you assume they are, they still deserve your respect, your professionalism, and your basic human decency. Alicia saved the document and put her tablet away. Through the aircraft window, she could see the lights of London beginning to twinkle in the distance. A city full of millions of people who deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, background, or circumstances. The transformation of SkyElite Airways had been complete, but the work of creating a more just and equitable world was ongoing. Every interaction was an opportunity to choose respect over prejudice, understanding over assumption, justice over convenience. As Flight 892 began its descent into Heathrow Airport, Alicia felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because she had punished people who had discriminated against her, but because she'd used her power to create positive change that would outlast any individual incident or viral video. The flight attendant, Elena, stopped by her seat one final time. "Thank you for flying with SkyElite today, Miss Brooks. I hope you have a wonderful time in London." "Thank you, Elena. You've provided excellent service." "That's very kind of you to say. We really try to make every passenger feel welcome and valued. You succeed, and that matters more than you know." As passengers disembarked, Alicia remained seated for a moment longer, watching people of every race, age, and background gather their belongings and prepare to continue their journeys. Each person deserved to travel with dignity. Each person deserved professional service and basic respect. Each person mattered. The viral video that had made her famous had ultimately been about much more than airline service or corporate policy. It had been about the fundamental truth that in a just society, how people look doesn't determine how they should be treated. That wisdom isn't measured by the ability to make snap judgments about strangers, but by the understanding that strangers are just people whose stories we don't know yet. Character, Alicia had learned, was indeed the only uniform that truly mattered. And in a world where character was increasingly rare, the choice to treat everyone with dignity and respect had become a revolutionary act. The airplane had landed safely. The passengers had been served professionally, and justice had been done not through punishment or retribution, but through the simple act of creating a world where everyone could travel with dignity. That was the real victory. That was the lasting change. That was the universal message that would outlive any viral video or trending hashtag treat people like they matter, because they do. If this story moved you, I want you to take action. Hit that like button right now to show your support for justice and equality. Subscribe to this channel because we bring you real stories about standing up for what's right. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Because change doesn't happen when we just watch from the sidelines. Change happens when we decide that discrimination is unacceptable, when we choose to treat everyone with dignity, and when we have the courage to speak up for what's right. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. And together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. So, smash that like button, hit subscribe with the notification bell turned on, and share this story with your friends and family. Because the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, you'll remember Alicia Brooks, and know that sometimes the quiet person in the corner might just have the power to change everything. Thanks for watching, and remember, character is the only uniform that truly matters.